About a month ago, I can safely say I caught the Persona bug. And almost immediately after finishing Persona 4 Golden, I started up Persona 3 FES. My reasoning for going backward rather than forward in the series was as such. I knew that Persona 4 had a lot of quality of life changes when compared to its predecessor. Persona 5 also not only has these quality of life changes, but improved dungeon design as well as an incredible leap in graphic fidelity. I figured I needed to play Persona 3 before I became too attached to the modern niceties of the series, and I think I made the right call. Persona 3 is a special game to a ton of people, and after finishing my playthrough, it's easy to see why. Let's start with some positives. In contrast with Persona 4, Persona 3 is significantly darker, figuratively and literally. If dark and depressing stories aren't your cup of tea, I understand, as I'm somewhat adverse to them myself, but regardless of your taste and tone, I would recommend you give Persona 3 a shot anyway, as it's clearly a game with a poignant message and isn't dark because that's what was in vogue, but rather because that's the tone required to get the message across. Memento Mori and all that. Not to mention, Persona up until P4 was a fairly dark series. Look no further than the events of Persona 2 Innocent Sin. It might not be as dark as the series it originated from, but it's not like this is some huge tonal shift. Memento Mori, death, dying. There's a lot of it in this game, and it doesn't just stop at NPC characters or the villains. Much like Aeris in Final Fantasy VII, I respect the decision to kill off characters like Shinjiro. It's not as strong as her death, but it's not really supposed to be. Besides, P3 saves the big guns for later. Even if you don't necessarily care about Shinji, chances are you care about Akihiko or even Ken, whose death affects them not just in the story but in gameplay. The loss of a party member is offset by the fact that Akihiko and Ken gain access to their ultimate personas once Shinji dies. These two are also the first characters to obtain their ultimate personas, so it serves as an introduction to the concept. Having these personas be relegated to certain story events as opposed to optional social links made me swallow not having social links with most of the main cast. That said, I still prefer the way it was in Persona 4, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Why don't we talk about the main cast now, because their dynamic is fairly different to the one we see in Persona 4. In P4, you felt like a tight-knit group of friends trying to solve a murder in your small town. Until the final hours of the game, the stakes are honestly somewhat low. Persona 3, on the other hand, not only has high stakes all the way from the beginning with the Dark Hour, but the party dynamic is also more distant. Over the course of the game, you do end up becoming great friends with these characters, much like in Persona 4, but for a long time, these characters feel like they're only together because of the circumstances. Kari, Junpei, and yourself have a bit of a camaraderie since you're all newbies, but Mitsuru feels like an acquaintance at best. Yukari especially doesn't like her, for reasons we discover later on. Then there's Akihiko, who never feels as standoffish as Mitsuru does, but also doesn't especially get close to the main character either. His and Ken's growth is done through Shinjiro, which is perfectly acceptable, it's just different. Fuka, man, I don't know, this character really doesn't do it for me. Pretty much all of her development begins and ends when she's introduced. She's also the only character in the main cast who doesn't lose someone close to them. The closest is Natsuki, who only moves away, whereas Mitsuru's dad moves away 6 feet under. Finally, there's Aigis. I'll go more in-depth into her in just a bit, but know that she's probably the character who feels closest to the main character in the game outside of optional social link romances, and I like her. A lot. She's on the 3x3. I also really like these designs. I'm not as sensitive as some are to designs that look too anime, but even still I can appreciate when designs don't go too far off the rails. In a game like Persona, that's kinda important since this is a contemporary setting. Thankfully though, they don't fuck it up. Main characters still look like main characters without feeling too out of place. Even the robot has a modest design without looking too simple. The gold trimmings around her joints contrast well with the utilitarian featureless body. The hood feet continue this trend of not adding on too many unnecessary features that or Sojima is bad at drawing feet. The only design I don't really care for is Chidori's. The design itself is fine, I just don't know what it's doing in this game. As far as I can tell, the only reason why Chidori would dress up as a gothic Lolita is because she's weird. I don't know, it's really not worth getting worked up over. To circle back to what I was saying earlier, I could see why someone might not like the more distant nature of the Persona 3 cast, but I think it made for a good change of pace. However, I was probably more attached to the characters of Persona 4 by the end thanks to its approach. That game had a bittersweet ending where I didn't want to say goodbye. I will say that both Persona 3 and 4 left me feeling quite sad near the end. With regards to P3, it wasn't because I was sad to say goodbye to the cast, but the game's ending had me down for another reason. So now's a better time than ever to start talking about it. I found the final month of Persona 3 to be one of the greatest finales to any JRPG I'd ever played. Maybe even the greatest finale in any video game. To go from the depressing atmosphere of December into the determined optimism of January, while the rest of the world falls apart, none the wiser of C's or their plan, really made me just want to keep playing until the end nonstop. The last boss was a legitimate challenge that was incredibly satisfying to overcome. Then there's everything afterwards, just nothing short of beautiful. Without going too much into it, let's just say it reminded me of Metal Gear Solid 3, where the game can't end until you choose it to. It made me feel much more connected to the Avatar character than anything like naming him after myself or picking from 3 dialogue options with meaningless outcomes. It's important that the final moments are also spent with Aigis, who, despite showing up about 1/3 through the game, is probably the second most important character. As she'll tell you, since she's a machine, the concept of life and death is foreign to her, and she slowly figures out what it means to have those things. She's crucial to getting the theme of the game across, and it's honestly baffling to me that the original release didn't allow you to social link with her and elaborate on her arc. And I don't think this just because she's on the 3x3. Although, maybe it was better off that her social link was added later when they had a better idea of what the social link should be like, as hers is probably my favorite out of any I did in the game, besides maybe the sun. Okay, maybe it's sorta because she's on the 3x3. But that leads into the social links as a whole. You can tell that while the foundation for the modern Persona games is pretty much all here, it's in a very unrefined state. Persona 3 had a very rocky development and was the first of its kind for the series, so I'm willing to cut it some slack, but I do want to point out the problems I had while playing P3, because I had a few. I guess I should start with the social links since I was just talking about them. Now, admittedly, I didn't finish every single social link in the game, but I did manage to complete a majority. Looking back on them, I can say that overall I liked a lot of them, however, the pacing on some of these social links are quite terrible. Most of the rank up events feel like almost nothing happens in them, they're spinning their wheels with the development of the storyline, or both. Tanaka is pretty much the same character throughout the entire social link, and Kenji is an absolute idiot, and the way you're supposed to get points towards another rank up is encouraging him to fuck his teacher. Only I get to do that, pal. But I think the worst social link in the game is the moon. It feels like they had one idea for where they wanted his character to go, realized at the last second he was an unlikable asshole, then completely 180'd his character at the last rank. The revelation about his deceased brother and not feeling like he could ever live up to him, so he turns to food? It's a great idea for a social link, but it's buried under 9 events of fat jokes and money scams. Like I said earlier, it seems they just didn't get the hang of things the first time around. It's fine. But my problems don't end there. Despite what I said earlier about C's feeling more like friends by the end of the game, the fact that you cannot social link Ken, Junpei, or Akihiko is quite disappointing. It doesn't help that unlike Persona 4, where there are events with the characters distributed throughout the months, the operations are really the only significant times these characters interact, until the final months or so. Atlus clearly wasn't adverse to social linking with your party too, as you can do so with the girls of the team. This means the girls will always feel closer to the main character than the guys ever will. In more ways than one, actually, since pretty much every female character's social link ends in a romance. As funny as this is, even if there are no consequences for doing this, it's still pretty shitty that if you want to be as thorough as possible with the social links, you need to be a two-timing bastard. Look, Chihiro, it's not that I don't like you, I just don't like you in that way. I'm just trying to fuse Melchizedek. Let's talk about Strega. This group is what you could consider the main villains of Persona 3. They're Persona users too, except unlike C's who are trying to get rid of the Dark Hour, Takaya, Jin, and Chidori use the Dark Hour as an alibi for paid assassinations. Ergo, they have a pretty good reason to keep the Dark Hour around. It's a promising start, but unfortunately this angle pretty much gets dropped shortly after they're introduced. There's more to their character, but all of the tragic backstories in the world can't protect them from being boring. Chidori is the only one with any meaningful development, and her crowning achievement is reviving Junpei from a gunshot wound he can't survive because it was in a cutscene instead of in a battle. Okay, sure. By the end of the game, I'm expected to believe that Takaya has been pulling the strings behind our backs and has all of Iwatodai believing that the end of the world is coming. I mean, he's technically not wrong, but you're telling me that people are believing anything this guy has to say? That's mostly a nitpick. I think my biggest problem with Strega is how ineffective they are in boss fights. As great as their battle theme is, it doesn't fit them in the slightest, as they're mildly challenging at best or pushovers at worst. Speaking of the battles, it's time to stop ignoring the 264 floor dungeon in the room. Tartarus itself I didn't really mind all that much, as checkpoints were frequent enough so it was simple to complete a few floors a night and save the rest for later. Of course, I did try the shotgun as much of the dungeon as I was allowed to, but that only really became viable halfway through the game thanks to the tired mechanic. I won't harp on this too much either, as it's only really annoying in the beginning hours, but I'll just say I'm glad it was dropped in later entries. I think Tartarus' biggest problem is it can get monotonous quickly. The changes in decor don't happen often enough, so you're going to be looking at the same randomly generated floors for about 2 months each in-game time. The full moon operations would be a great opportunity to introduce proper dungeons and or set pieces to break this monotony. In the beginning, it seems like this is what's going to happen when you stop the shadow on the train or search for the shadow in the Love Hotel, but after a while, these operations just become boss battles. It feels like they wanted these operations to be more special but ran out of time. Then there's the battles themselves. Persona 3 fans have probably been waiting for this the whole time. In battles, you only control your avatar character, while the others are controlled by AI. You can give them general commands such as attacking non-stop, support, and knocking the enemies down, but you're always at the mercy of the AI. This is something that stops a lot of people from really getting into Persona 3, and why most will point you towards the PSP port of the game, which lets you control them. I'm not going to defend the AI party members, but I will say I wasn't pulling my hair out over the rogue Marin Karen or anything like memes would suggest. Mostly, the AI worked just fine. Until the final boss, where half of my stress came from hoping Yukari would use Medi Arahan instead of D Arahan, or God forbid, try to go for the kill. Buffs like Mataru Kaja would also be regularly mishandled by the AI. They would constantly reapply the buff when only one party member had lost it, effectively wasting the casting. And unlike Persona 4, buffs don't extend if you already have them, they just straight up miss. These could be deal breakers for some, but for me they were only mild annoyances. All of these issues compounded, however, make the dungeon crawling the weakest I've played in the series. As for fusing personas, it's back to the Nocturne method of skill inheritance, where the game will decide with RNG what moves your new persona gets. I don't think it's controversial to say this, but I'm glad they did away with this in later titles. Maybe someone could argue that not getting to choose the skills makes the game harder, which I suppose is true, but I'll take a difficulty drop over sitting in the Velvet Room for 20 minutes trying to get No Light and Mudo boost on Thanatos or something. Half the fun in these games is building the perfect persona, and not getting to choose the inherited skills just adds an unnecessary roadblock to that element. All of this is to say that Persona 3 is a game with high highs and lowish lows. Sadly, those lows tend to stem mostly from the gameplay, which I should reiterate I don't think is terrible, just not up to snuff with its contemporaries. Its gameplay is far from the worst I've ever played, but those small annoyances can get to you when the game you're playing is a 90-hour JRPG. This doesn't just come from not controlling your party members either, so I don't think this complaint I have is fixed by just simply playing the portable version. With all that said though, pretty much everything else I really like. I didn't even talk about the music, although not much left can be said about it. I think everyone already knows Persona 3 soundtrack is some of the best in the genre. Just be aware I think this as well. Oh, and one more thing, since I couldn't think of anywhere else to put this, but I love that each party member has their own way of using their evokers. Junpei has this rushed, excited pose when he brandishes his. Yukari puts it to her forehead hesitantly, as if she's trying her hardest not to screw this up. Akihiko places it right at his temple, no flash or anything. Each of these show a little bit of their character, and I love that. I just want to make it abundantly clear to anyone who's a fan of Persona 3 that I totally understand why. if you want more proof, I'm writing this hot off finishing my first playthrough of Persona 3. This was meant to be a small piece of a larger video coming out way later in the year, but the ending of this game touched and compelled me to put my thoughts down as soon as possible, and 8 pages later, here we are. Have you ever finished a movie, album, or, well, a game and just couldn't stop thinking about it after? That's how this game made me feel. Persona 3 is a special game. As I alluded to near the beginning and mentioned near the end, this is just a sneak peek of an upcoming video I'm hoping to have finished within a couple of months. I'm going to be talking about all of the JRPGs I've played throughout the year, and that includes Persona 4 and Persona 5 Royal, the latter of which I'm currently playing through right now. Stay on the lookout for that video in the near future. Until then, I'm going to get back to playing Persona 5. Be back soon.
But Tech, aren't you going to play The Answer?
Oh yeah, right, the answer. Yeah, hang on.
Hello everybody, and welcome to Let's Play Action Replay Max. So yeah, good news, we are now beginning the Persona 3 run. It is doing some with the code list. Yeah, I put in the disk. So right now, Action Replay Max, I put in the disk, and it worked, it loaded up. I took out the actual Replay Max disk, and then inserted the Persona 3